Bum 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 bum.
Tomatoes?
Hello, welcome to video 4. What is timeline properties? So the timeline properties are different from our playback properties. Our timeline properties, if we open up our timeline, are basically going to be these values right here. The properties unique to a timeline, and they change the way it works. So let's go ahead and look at those. We have basically these 5 values here, and we'll cover them roughly in order, and I'll explain what they do and how we might use them. Some of these are going to be difficult to explain, but I'll explain the theory behind them. So let's jump right into it. First one's going to be the use last keyframe. This one is hard to explain because its basic use is going to be coupled with our looping, or the ability to have things set in a specific position at the end. And it goes along great with an animation where you can actually see the difference. Let's say it's a player walking, and the keyframes are their foot on the ground and their foot on the ground. Use last keyframe basically tells this last keyframe here. So the last value we're going to output. This is our last keyframe, technically, our last value. It says to go ahead and use this value as the last value if we have this checked. If we don't have it checked, it's basically going to use the second to last value. It's not going to output the last one. So if we had something smoothly running, let's say this is someone's feet literally on the ground. They raise them, and then they put them back on the ground. If this was a loop where basically their feet are on the ground, they raise and they go back down, you traditionally wouldn't use your last keyframe. You would use the second to last, so that way when it loops, the beginning is their foot back on the ground. So foot on the ground, raised up, almost to the bottom, and then it loops back over, now it's back on the ground. If you're using the last keyframe, you now have the first frame and the last frame with the person's feet on the ground, so you end up possibly getting something like a stutter. You're going to have feet on the ground, up, feet on the ground, and then repeat feet on the ground, up. So that's what the use last keyframe does. Basically, it determines whether or not you're going to use the value from the last keyframe, or if you're going to simply not, so that way you can smoothly run. Now, if you're not using animation, you're using, for example, something that's going to fire and forget, one-time pulse. Maybe this is a something that fires off once. In our example here, if we were to run it, and I hit the T key, our light goes off and then pulses on and then goes back off. If I wanted to make sure the value was the same as the start and the end, because I'm setting it up like this, then I want to make sure I use the last keyframe. That way I'm starting at 0 and ending at 0, rather than starting at 0 and ending at maybe 0.001 if I don't tell it to use the last keyframe. So that's how basically you would determine if you want to use that or not. Do you want this last value to be the last value? Yes, use the last keyframe. If not, leave it off, so that way when you're looping, it's going to be smooth. You do have the ability to change that at runtime. That is this node right here. Now it's kind of funkily named. It's called the set timeline length mode. But if you look at this, we have the use last keyframe, yes or no, and we have length or frame, last keyframe for the version. So if you want to change it at runtime, you have the set timeline length mode node, and you can change it between the last keyframe, which is basically this is checked, or you have the length, which means this is not checked. Oops, did not mean to delete that. Okay, so we'll go to the next property. Our next property is going to be autoplay. This one's pretty simple. If I go in here and hit play and hit T, it starts up and it stops. But I have to hit the T key in order to fire it. The T key fires off my play from start event. If I turn on autoplay and I compile and save and hit play, now you'll notice it's going to go ahead and autoplay. It only plays it once because we've only told it to play once. If we want to play it more than once, we have the loop option. So now if I hit the loop option and autoplay and hit play, well, it's not going to work. I've mentioned in the first video, if you watched it, when you adjust these properties, you need to make sure you save and compile, so that way it'll take effect. And now you'll notice I have an auto looping pulse. I didn't have to run anything extra or make sure I keep track of it. I told our timeline we want to autoplay and we want to loop. And of course, I can uncheck autoplay, compile and save, and hit play, and now it won't happen until I trigger it. I told it to play from start, and it's going to continue on. Replicated is for multiplayer. I'm not really going to cover on that much, but if you need these timeline values replicated, then you would use the replicated option. And if you need them replicated, you'll know you need them replicated because, well, you're working in multiplayer and you know you need them replicated. That's basically what it is. This is for multiplayer. You'll know if you need it or not. Our last one is the ignore time dilation. By default, if we were to adjust the time dilation, so for example, speed up or slow down the dilation of the game or this actor, the timeline will be affected as well because it's taking the tick information from the game to drive the time on our timeline. So if I go in here, I'd say, okay, when we hit play, we're going to adjust our custom time dilation. We're going to run it at 2. And we'll go ahead and hit play, and we'll hit T, and you'll notice it's going to run twice as fast. Heck, let's go with 5. And we'll hit play, we'll hit T, and you notice our pulse is super quick now. Because the time dilation in our actor is running at 5 times faster than normal. However, if we wanted something to run at normal speed at all times, maybe it's something that's time sensitive, then we can tell this timeline to ignore dilation, compile and save, and hit play. Now when I hit T, my dilation's still 5, but my timeline doesn't care. It's going to go ahead and run at its normal speed. So that's what our ignore time dilation node is for. If we go back to our event graph, let me save and compile, you'll find we have nodes for all of those in here. We have the ability to, where's it at? Get ignore time dilation. We can get things such as the, like I showed you there, the set the timeline length mode, the, where's it at? Ignore. Oh, where is ignore? Okay, we have in here, we have keyframe I showed, autoplay and loop. That's what I meant to do, which of course I always, here we go, set looping. We have the ability to, basically we have the ability to adjust any of those things inside of our graph just by dragging in the appropriate node, which just didn't, well, there we go. And we can set it at runtime. Of course I had, sorry about this. It grabbed the wrong one because it's being a giant pain in the butt. Where did our timeline component go? Yeah, here we go. Set looping. That's what I meant to do. And you notice it's the correct one because it's our timeline component. And of course, because it's a timeline component, we need to make sure we plug in our correct timeline from our components variables on the left. Now for other things, we have our timeline length, playback position. These are getters that basically give us back the length of our timeline. It doesn't matter if we're starting from somewhere else. It doesn't matter if our time dilation's changed. It doesn't matter anything. This is our length value of our timeline. This getter will get back the length of our timeline. Playback position, let's go ahead and hook this up here. Let's go ahead and hook this up into our update. Like this. Let's go ahead and hit play. Run our timeline, and you'll notice it's playing it back. Now keep in mind we've adjusted our dilation, so that's why it's running so quickly. If I was to go ahead and just plug this back in, disable our dilation, tell it to play a bit, and there we go. Every single time our timeline is firing off, our position is updated. We can get where along that timeline we are, and we can go ahead and get back that value. So that's what our get timeline length and get playback position nodes are for. In addition to that, I don't know why it keeps going back to the animation section. That is highly annoying. Yep. And then in addition to that, we have the timeline length setter right here. In addition to getting, we can set the length of our timeline down to a shorter value. So if we were to plug this in, for example, and let's get rid of our dilation. Let's set this here, and we'll set this here. We're going to go ahead and hit play. Let's unhook this from the update, so that way we only do there. Let's unhook this here. Let's go ahead and plug in the length here again, so we know when it's finished, like this. And let's go ahead and hit compile and save. We'll get an error The error is because we're not telling it which timeline to run. Grab our property example timeline. Again, property example timeline, property example name. This is this timeline. Compile and save. Hopefully you'll know that this doesn't work. Doesn't work because we said, hey, your new timeline length is 0. Okay, well, I really can't do much, so I'm just going to go ahead and update once and finish. And then this finish string runs, and you notice it says, well, 0. We can, of course, go in and we could go to 4. We'll compile and save and hit play. We'll hit T. It's going to play back. It's going to stop. And it's going to continue. At the end of our timeline, even though our length is 2 seconds, we still have something continuing on. We still have other values in here. So for example, if I was to do, let's say we did something like that at 3 seconds. Compile and save. We'll go ahead and hit play. We'll hit T. Fires up, fires down, fires back up, stays up, timeline ends. So even though our default length is 2 seconds here, we can still have values passed. So maybe you want to design something where you know, it continues on like this for whatever reason. This would be really weird because you could just loop it. But let's say you had something like this. This allows you to technically adjust the timeline at runtime by adjusting the timeline length. Now, it's a little weird for this example because technically all we're doing is extending it from 2 seconds to 4. But, you know, maybe your timeline is 1 second. Let's say your timeline was designed properly. Let's say we went in here and we went add a key. We drop this down. And see, even again, you know, this is honestly this is a stupid example as well because all we're doing is repeating, which is kind of pointless. Oops, what I have value for? Yeah, value 4. I mean, this is kind of ridiculous. Like, here's a 1 second timeline, and if we were just to repeat this and extend it, it would go up and down. I mean, it would look really weird. Setting your timeline length is useful if you need to maybe adjust it to be brief, or you have one timeline that has multiple sections. Because we can use external curves, which is covered in a different video, you could create one timeline that's maybe a small chunk here, a big chunk here, a bigger chunk here, and you could have like different valleys basically. You could have a 1 second one value. Here, let's show you what I mean. Oops. You can go with something like this, and then we'll go back to here. We will add a new key here. We'll change this one to 1.5 and 2. And change this one back to 2 and 0, and then this would be what? We'd have another one here. This would be 2.5 and 3. This one goes back down to 3 and 0. And let's just leave it at that. Let me get rid of the other keys. Let me go ahead and turn these to auto so we have nice, smooth, happy keys. There we go. So right here we have 3 different values. We are going up to 1 second. Sorry, we're going up to a value of 1. One of these is not set to auto. They're set to auto. That's a weird curve. Anyways, we have a value of 1, a value of 2, and a value of 3 curve. If we were to, for example, determine we want something of a strength of 2, you could always go in here, set your timeline length to, for example, that would be 2 seconds, and then set your new time to 1 second. That means it's going to start at 1 second, and it's going to have a length of 2 seconds. So it's going to play this section here. Or you go in and you tell it, okay, well, you know what? I need something even stronger. So we'll set the start time at 2, and we'll set the length to 3. Now, it's still going to be a 1 second duration, but we're going to go from 2 seconds to 3 seconds this time. So that's a use for your setting the timeline length. Maybe if you want to split a timeline, one single curve, up into multiple sections, so that way you didn't have to have like a small curve and then just change the value of it, a multiplier. You could have different designed things in the same curve. So I know that's a lot of random weird stuff, but this is the adjustment of the properties inside your timeline. It gives you basically fine-tunes it, allows you to change things at runtime and change things at design time with these ones. And they're meant for fine-tuning. This was just meant to cover, these are some options you can have, these are some things you might be able to do with it, and literally just get as creative as you want. That's going to wrap up our property examples for the timelines. We covered a couple setter and getter nodes. We covered what these did at the top. Basically, if you want things to use the last keyframe for smooth looping, autoplay from start, looping automatically, replicated over the network, and whether it should ignore time dilation or not. Remember, anytime you adjust these properties, compile and save, or you're going to have a bad day. And that's it. That's going to wrap up our timeline properties video.